was like good.
What TC are you? What TC are you?
I'm doing Mexico City water crisis.
Oh, that's right.
Which one are you doing?
Plastics and cars.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to. I mean, I like my TC, but that was my first choice one.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. On behalf of LIVAS and the Brazil Center, it's my pleasure to welcome you. The FORO URGENTE, or FORO URGENTE, series at LIVAS is designed to bring together academics, activists, and members of the community to discuss pressing issues in Latin American politics. And the burning of the forests in the Amazon and the surrounding political firestorm is certainly one of these issues. So as a historian of Brazil, I just wanted to introduce this panel that what I find particularly striking at this moment is its recrudescence of an aggressively anti-environmental posture on the part of Brazil's political leadership. And this is being, of course, justified in the name of economic development and national sovereignty. Now, this was Brazil's position at the UN conference on the environment at Stockholm in 1972. Along with many developing countries, actually, and that conference was a milestone in the global environmental movement. So perhaps it's no surprise that a president who's waxed nostalgic about the heavy-handed tactics of Brazil's military government would also cling to its determination to develop the Amazon at all costs. But Brazil has changed significantly in the last 50 years, in no small part because its economy, its society, and its culture have become much more integrated to global circuits. And while Brazil never rightfully renounced its claim to sovereignty over the Amazon, following the UN conference in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 in particular, its leaders did assume much more responsibility or commitment, at least in discourse and to some extent in practice, to becoming a protector of tropical forests and to signing on to sustainable development. So where do we stand now and where are things going? So we're fortunate to have with us panelists from various disciplines to discuss the origins and the implications of the burning of the forest. Our first speaker will be Eugenio Arima, who's an associate professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment here at UT. His PhD is in geography from Michigan State, and his research explores the intersection of land change science, spatial analysis, and landscape ecology in Brazil. Together with colleagues at the University of Brasilia, he's working on a study of large-scale agricultural expansion in the Cerrado, the tropical savanna of central Brazil. Next will be Everett Shore, who's a research fellow at the School of Law here at UT. He earned his PhD in Latin American history at University of Texas, and since 2015, he's coordinated a project to create a digital repository of historical documentation concerning quilombos, or descendants of runaway slaves, working with their members to curate their community-based archives and strengthen their legal claims to land and resources. Next is Cynthia Simmons, who joins us from the Department of Geography at the University of Florida. She's interested in how social processes in the Amazon ramify across a multiplicity of scales: individual, local, regional, national, and global, and the impact that these interactions have on local environments and social conditions. And finally, Searles is the founder and director of Chris Searles is founder and director of BioIntegrity, a nonprofit based in Austin that seeks to increase awareness of the value of Earth's vital ecosystems. BioIntegrity's events and educational presentations have led to the protection of more than 250,000 acres of tropical forests around the world. And one last announcement: the Brazil Center will be sponsoring 2 other Amazon-related events this fall, so please keep your eye out. One on October 15th, Eve Bratman will be presenting from her new book, which looks at the challenges of sustainable development. She conducted years of research in the Amazon in multiple sites, researching this problem and this issue. And we have a screening of a film with the director, Bruno Mochinho, Amazonia Groove, on November 6th. It's an award-winning film that looks at various musical genres in the Amazon. So please join me in welcoming the panelists.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Lilas and the Brazil Center, for organizing this event. What I want to do here is just give you a brief overview of the fire situation in the Brazilian Amazon, talk a little bit about what's different this year from the previous years, and then conclude with some thoughts. So we need two ingredients to have fire. I had an old friend that used to joke, a lot of gasoline in just a little spark and you have fire. But to burn a tropical forest, you need, dry season, low precipitation, fragmentation of the forest. It makes the forest flammable. On the other side is, of course, you need some source of ignition. And the main source of ignition here are humans. Humans use fire for the first two, the forest as a process of deforestation, maintenance. They burn pastures, for example, to help in the regrowth of forests. And sometimes that fire spreads across the forest, nearby forest, and cause accidental fires as well. But I want to concentrate on deforestation. Fire is essentially the last process of deforestation. So many of you have the image of the Amazon as an evergreen forest, and yes, it's evergreen all year around. It's green. It doesn't lose its leaves in most places. But we do have a pronounced dry season here in the southern part of the basin, up to from 3 to 5 months of dry climate. And if you look back, so what people do here, they usually, in the deforestation process, they cut down the trees in the beginning of the dry season, let it dry, the biomass dry, and then in the middle to the end of the dry season, they burn that biomass because it's 300 tons of biomass, and you have to convert that in fertilizing ashes, and essentially that's where fire occurs, right? So it's part of the deforestation process. If you look back, this is a graph that we put together years ago. This green line here is deforestation rates in Brazil. As you can see, it went down significantly. These bars here are numbers of fires, different metrics of fires that are measured by satellites. So usually, the number of fires in burned area follow the deforestation trend. There are exceptions. So this line here is the average precipitation in the basin. So in years where you have droughts, which are these lower points, you can see spikes on fires, even when you have low deforestation, all right? So what's different this year? Well, we are not in a drought year. This is, oops, what happened? Oh my goodness.
Always so opportune.
We have a laptop. Can I borrow someone's laptop?
Somebody else have a laptop? I was gonna say, if we need tech help, I can go get it, but.
Can I think it's gonna update, it's gonna take forever. I think it's better if we borrow.
I have a laptop in that blue briefcase right next to you.
Can you install my presentation here, please?
Do I need to go get the tech person?
It's here.
Is that your professor that you're doing research with? Okay. Nice. I dropped out of his class last year. Yeah. No, I like him. He seems really cool. was really good. The last thing I had to eat was like a very sad chicken sandwich from the JCM. Just had like 2
Same thing, so
Yeah.
2 days inside. And then this.
Same.
Or I don't usually have this, but today.
No, I get that. I have class from 9:30 until like 3:30, so.
Class from 9:30 to 2. Yeah. Today I have a meeting. So basically, I haven't been at my house since 9 o'clock this morning.
I'm actually going to move up a little bit.
You're gonna do what? Oh, move there.
Move there just because like some people are blocking.
All right. Back to the presentation. So what's different this year? First of all, it's not a drought year. This is a map showing how far from the average the rainfall is in the world, and this purple color shows that it's above the average, the historical average for the 6 previous months. And if you do the same analysis for the previous 3 months, it's also above the average. So we are not in a drought year. What is different this year, we still don't have the numbers for 2019, but the partial numbers indicate that we are back to high deforestation rates. So probably this year we are going back to the 10,000 square kilometer numbers. And of course, I think there's a difference this year as well with respect to political actions, rhetoric, and how that might change expectations in the field. So a few examples here, there's a long list, I'm not going to go through details here, but for some policies that were implemented as soon as the new president took office. They moved, for example, the indigenous affairs agencies from the Ministry of Agriculture from the Ministry of Justice to the Ministry of Agriculture. So the Ministry of Agriculture is dealing with indigenous affairs. He appointed Ricardo Salles to the as a Ministry of Environment, and he has very close relation with the Rural Caucus in Congress, which is the most powerful group of legislators in Congress. And Salles froze, you probably have heard the Amazonian Fund, where billions of dollars that were donated from by Norway and Germany. He froze all the expenditures from that fund. And that fund was actually important because it financed in these years, for example, 466 enforcement field missions in Arima. So those were the ones who went after folks who were not complying with environmental regulations. That is gone. You have a 42% reduction in environmental fines. If you look at the numbers compared this year with the previous one, there's a 42% reduction in environmental fines in Amazonia. And those are crimes against flora, were the ones related to deforestation. And of course, there's the rhetoric. You can, every day you can read something that deals with environmental issues. For example, he claims that environmental lands are oversized. There's too much indigenous lands in Amazonia. It should be shrinked. That IBAMA, which is the Environmental Enforcement Agency, is a fine industry. In other words, issuing fines to collect money. So he's going to stop that. So IBAMA should not be issuing fines to people who are not complying with environmental laws. And recently he fired the INPE is the Brazilian Space Agency that monitors deforestation, and the director published the numbers that show that deforestation this year is way higher than previous years. So he claimed that INPE director might be at the service of some environmental NGOs, for example. So why this is important? Because it changes expectations from those who are doing deforestation in the field. If you believe that the risks of being caught are small, that you're actually that you should be deforesting and putting fires and without any consequence, of course you're going to do that, right? So here's the situation of fires in August 19, this past month. So this is the well-known arc of deforestation, this part here. And what's really surprising is the amount of fire here in this area. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about this part here, because this is a new frontier. This is the part that is already consolidated. This is where the soybeans are being planted, but this is new frontier development type of deforestation. And if you look, these are colors, I'm not sure if you can see very well, but the red and the dark orange are more bright signals. So the satellite passes through this area, and the brighter the signal, it means that the fire is hotter or that it's larger, right? So it means probably that it's biomass forest that it's being burned. Here's a map showing fires, and these areas here in dark green are protected areas. So lots of fires in this area that are supposed to be protected areas, but folks are putting fire deforestation to claim that land for themselves. This is the DR-150, a major road that connects the soybean production here to a port up here. Again, a lot of fire here in this area. This is an indigenous area. I think Professor Simmons is going to talk about this particular indigenous reserve from the Mundurucus. There is also some fire here inside the indigenous reserve. So here more to the west, again, these are frontiers. I was there maybe 5 years ago. It's the Wild West. I'm not kidding. A lot of violence, very dangerous place. We took just a side here, took the wrong turn in the road. I thought it was actually the road, the correct road, but it was a logging road. The loggers actually got angry, stopped us, started questioning us. So it's a very, very an outlaw place. But it's where the frontier now is expanding. Okay, so we are jumping to the core of the Amazon here in terms of development. So why does it matter to finish here? Well, there are several things here that are important. One is the scientific community is very concerned about what we call the savanization of the evergreen forest. So if this trend continues, the Amazon will become a savanna, because the forest is a pump that put moisture into the atmosphere, and according to some estimates, up to 40% of the rainfall that falls in the Amazon is recycled water from the forest. So if you cut down, burn that forest, the long term is that you're gonna end up with a savanna type of forest, especially in the southern part. And of course, the Amazon has been a sink of carbon. This is something that we discovered in the last 10 years. A very important sink of carbon in the carbon cycle. And with all these fires and deforestation and diebacks that is being projected, the Amazon will become a source of carbon and disruption of hydrological cycle. So those are my, I'm not going to talk about this, but those are my comments. I will pass the word to the next speaker.
Thanks for your patience, everybody. Oh, well, great. Thanks, everybody. I'm Everett Shore, and I would like to thank Lilas Benson for organizing this event and inviting me to speak alongside such expert speakers. When Paloma first reached out to me a couple weeks ago, I was actually in Brazil with the Rappaport Center, meeting with Quilombola activists, indigenous leaders, and their supporters, who in many ways are on the front lines of this fire, which has been decades, if not centuries in the making. And it's these populations to whom I wish to dedicate my talk today. I argue that we cannot fully understand the drivers and dynamics of this most recent wave of Amazonian fires without also taking into account the decades-long systematic and bipartisan assault on the hard-fought constitutional rights, lands, and livelihoods of traditional peoples in Brazil. Indigenous populations, quilombolas, ribeirinhos, caiçaras, seringueiros, quebradeiros de coco, and other peasant communities. There are approximately 306,000 indigenous peoples residing on 422 demarcated territories in the Amazonian region, which is comprising roughly 23% of the total land size. According to numerous studies, the current Amazonian fires, 2/3 of which have been located on private lands, but 1/3 are occurring in environmentally protected or indigenous lands, likely set by farmers and ranchers to clear land for the expansion of agribusiness. And this is a map which was sent to me by my colleagues at the Instituto Socioambiental, ISA, a socio-environmentalist NGO based in Sao Paulo, which you might be seeing in the news more recently. This demonstrates fires throughout Brazil, located specifically on indigenous lands. And you can notice that the intensification of these fires are occurring not necessarily in the Amazon, but in the Cerrado region, which in many ways could, and perhaps I'm wrong about this, but appears to be especially vulnerable to the expansion of fires. In fact, there have been 3,500 fires in 148 different indigenous territories this past month alone. And so I argue that to comprehend this crisis and to propose solutions to redress it, policymakers, scholars, the public at large must confront this administration's attacks against the rights of traditional peoples, as well as the historical legacies of violence and dispossession that preceded Jair Bolsonaro. Now, it's true that this administration appears exceptional in its public disdain for the constitutional protections of traditional peoples. It's almost a cliche at this point that every U.S. news article will cite remarks that he made in December about how he vowed he will never cede another centimeter of land to the demarcation of indigenous or quilombola peoples. But he said a lot of other things as well. Take, for instance, during a 2017 campaign fundraiser, then at the time the presidential front-runner Bolsonaro disparaged quilombola communities residing in his native Vale do Ribeira, which is an area where I've done extensive field work. He said, wherever there is an Indian reservation, there is also mineral wealth underneath it. We've got to fix this. Unfortunately today, we don't have the autonomy to fix it. And that's just the Indian reserves. Then you have the quilombolas, who are another joke. I went to a quilombola in El Dorado Paulista. Look, the skinniest afro over there weighed only 7 arrobas. That's a unit of measurement to weigh slaves and cattle. They don't do anything. I don't think they even manage to procreate anymore. That's 1 billion reais every year that are wasted on them, end quote. And he's also said this as recently as 2 weeks ago on national television. To protect the Amazon, command and control enforcement actions are not enough. We need to give opportunity to all of this population so they can develop like the rest of the country. So what's he saying here? I'm serious, not just rhetorical. What's the implications of something like this? Well, he's essentially vowing to push indigenous people to develop on his terms. He's arguing that carving out indigenous territories for indigenous people only serves to separate them from the rest of the population, quote, like animals in a zoo, which is also something he said in December. Now, his incendiary remarks are matched only by his devastating policies, which Eugenio touched on earlier, eviscerating the budgets of FUNAI and INCRA, which are the federal agencies responsible for titling indigenous and quilombola lands respectively, right? Or endeavoring to place them under the control of big agribusiness in violation of the Constitution. He's cheerleaded mining on indigenous reserves and protected areas, most flagrantly on the Yanomami reserves in northern Brazil near Venezuela, where a recent news report found 20,000 gold miners on Yanomami territory. Then there's the intimidation, repression of social movements, NGOs, and their supporters, culminating with the assassination in July of indigenous leader Amira Wajapi by gold miners in the northern state of Amapá. But with all this, I want to focus on 2 current policy proposals in particular. And these are policies that are empirically linked to deforestation and fire. And that's the promotion of mining and agribusiness on protected, mining and livestock on protected areas. So when we were in Brasilia with Professor Karen Engel and I, and also with David Pereira, doctoral student here at Leilas, we met with Joênia Wapichana, who is the first indigenous woman elected to Congress in Brazil. She's the first indigenous lawyer in Brazil who successfully argued before the Inter-American Court on behalf of the territorial recognition of her community, which is Raposa Serra do Sol. And as we're meeting with her, she informed us of 2 proposed amendments to the Constitution, Amendment 187 and Amendments 187 and 343, which Congress was taking up as the U.S., well, not the U.S. unfortunately, but as a steady stream of condemnation is coming about the Amazonian fires, Congress was debating measures to promote policies that would exacerbate these problems. Now, one of these measures was tabled, the one related to mining for now, but the other one, 187, passed in the Commission on Constitutional Justice, which is another joke. And the president of the Chamber of Deputies, Rodrigo Maias, has said that he may not call for a special commission to form, which is required to move this bill further. For now, I think because of public international outcry and public opposition, but what happens when we stop paying attention several weeks from now or months from now? And while these policies are particularly odious, these proposals were put forward before Bolsonaro. And while Bolsonaro was still a fringe member of Congress, there was proposed amendment to the Constitution number 215, proposed in 2000, which would delegate responsibility for the titling of indigenous lands to Congress rather than from FUNAI. It would call for compensating large landowners that would be on, if they had to give up lands in the name of indigenous reserves. And it would also establish what's called the Marco Temporal, which I'm having trouble to translate precisely, but essentially it would limit indigenous communities. It would define as indigenous communities only those that were recognized by the Brazilian government in 1988 when the Constitution was developed. So it would disqualify the territorial claims and self-identification of communities that have happened in the 30 years since I've been alive. So, just as we can't understand this crisis without revisiting prior legislation, prior legislative proposals and court decisions that aim to either suppress entirely or to severely undercut the constitutional rights of protected groups. I don't think we can also diagnose the problem and propose solutions without taking into account a litany of mega projects, which are championed by political leaders across all spectrums, that have placed enormous pressure on the environment and the livelihoods of traditional peoples as well. It's not just Bolsonaro and his party that views the Amazon as a reserve, as a reserve of natural resources to be harnessed in the name of the advancement of Brazilian development. That was also the rhetoric and policy of the Workers' Party too, which oversaw the construction of the Belo Monte Dam, which is the third largest hydroelectric dam in the world, which displaced tens of thousands of traditional peoples in the Altamira region of Pará, or the São Luís de Tapajós River Dam, which was ultimately terminated by Dilma in 2016, only after massive international outcry and protests of the Munduruku peoples. And to conclude, I want to call attention to a distant corner of the legal Amazon, isolated from the current fires for now, but nonetheless on the front lines of another fire that's 200 years in the making. And it's one that involves the United States, and it's one in which maybe we can do something about this. And that's the Technology Safeguard Agreement, which was signed in March between the Trump and Bolsonaro administrations, which seeks to promote further U.S. investment in the Rocket Launch Center of Alcântara, known as the CLA. This proposal threatens to remove hundreds of Quilombola communities from ancestral lands and surrounding ecosystems on the Alcântara Peninsula in the state of Maranhão, with devastating impacts on the local economy, food sovereignty of Alcântara. And this is not the first time that Quilombolas in Alcântara have sacrificed their lands and livelihoods for the CLA. During the 1980s, approximately 3,000 communities were displaced. Not 3,000 communities, 3,000 individuals in 300 different communities. It's important to be accurate. Are displaced, cutting them off from their primary source of food sovereignty, being the Atlantic coast. These are fishing communities, as well as the lush forests that surround the coast where they would plant subsistence garden plots. They were forcibly relocated to what are called 7 agro-villas, which are operated by the Brazilian Air Force that haven't been updated in over 25 years. Now they want to do this again in the name of national development. Even though the CLA has proven to be a disaster, it's last in the news in 2003 when a rocket exploded on the launch pad, killing 25 people. And worse, I could go on and on about this, but I need to cede the ground to other speakers. But we have been working closely with David Pereira, who, if you don't know him, you have to get to know David, who is still on the ground in Maranhão doing his dissertation field research this year. He's linked to a number of social movement organizations that we have just prepared a letter that we have sent to Congress today with the Rappaport Center. And there's this campaign which I want to circulate, and I can email attendees of this talk. Oh, not connected to the internet, that's okay. We have an English translation of this campaign that explains the CLA and proposes actions that we can take to put pressure on the U.S. Congress to call attention to this proposal. So, yeah, estamos juntos.
Okay, I also want to thank Luna for inviting me to participate in this very important panel discussion. It's a real honor to be here with my colleagues who have a great deal of knowledge of this issue in the Brazilian Amazon. Much of what I'm going to say well, not much. I don't have to say a lot of things because my colleagues have covered a lot of it. So I'm going to try to focus my talk, not the few remarks I would like to make. I have to admit, I've been invited to participate. I thought to myself, okay, why should it matter to you? And that really I had to think about. What is it? Why should it matter? And at first it was obvious. I went the wrong way. Oh, okay. So instead, why it should matter to you, I thought, okay, should it matter to you? I thought about it in terms of a question. And what can I present that will make that impact and make you think it should matter? And first thought was, of course, it should matter. Self-interest, self-preservation, as Dr. Arima demonstrated, that the deforestation and destruction of the Amazon has impacts through global climatological teleconnections, can impact precipitation in the U.S. I mean, so there's many reasons why you should be concerned about what's happening in the Amazon. And then, of course, there's also biodiversity preservation. If you care about biodiversity, you should be concerned and you should care. And if you are concerned about indigenous self-determination, you should care. So yeah, of course you should care. And then I thought to myself, why is this even a question? It's clear you should care. And made me think about just really how polarized the discourse around Amazonian development has been, both within Brazil and outside of Brazil. You have the one side, they're pro-development, and they see this has to happen. And on the very far extreme, you have the contra-destruction. And there seems to be this real gap in between, talking about Amazonian futures. And there's real concern. What is the Amazon future going to be? Who should decide? And recently, with political shifts, with this now movement to the right, the environment has become much more politicized, and these social divisions have solidified. And so what used to be environmental problems weren't necessarily a left and a right argument, have in fact become very, very polarized. In the US, of course, in Brazil, in Bolivia. And so on one side you have fires have become the rallying cry for the environmentalists and the NGOs. And on the other side you have the, those who are, to use pro-development, basically calling it fake news. So really the fire isn't a problem because there's always fire. So, it's really just they're trying to, create a political message. And I think this really should be a concern to everybody as well, because really fire is a cause for concern. I have a different reason for why I think it's a cause for concern, and I'm going to try to make that point to you. When we think about a sustainable Amazon future, there are many challenges. We do have to consider global climate change that can impact the precipitation levels, whether there will be a drought in the Amazon impacting the forests. There's increasing global demand for food and resources, which the Amazon happens to have plenty of. It's a very resource-rich region. And then you have the domestic demands, this need to economically develop, the need to improve the social welfare. And so this leaves the governments and many of the Amazonian nations, wanting to pursue development. And so development, how do you develop the Amazon? You build infrastructure, create access to regions, the resources, to bring land into productivity, to make access to those mines. And so you have, infrastructure projects. And infrastructure isn't new, to Amazonia. In fact, when the military government in the Brazilian Amazon opened up the region in 1964 through 1989 with massive highway network to bring in soy and cattle, creating a modern agricultural region. Today, some of the, one of the leading beef production areas is in fact in the Amazon. 20, 30 years ago, they said, soy would never happen in the Amazon because of the climatological conditions. Well, soy is in the Amazon thanks to the infrastructure. And as Dr. Arima pointed out, infrastructure, roads, basically is linked to deforestation. Deforestation is linked to fire. And so fire is, I would argue, really much more of a symptom of what I think I see as a much larger underlying threat to the Amazon that we really should be thinking about. And that I've tried to kind of make it my mission lately, past several years, trying to make this point clear. And the fires really are worse to come when we think about the massive infrastructure investments that are right now planned for the Amazon basin. Underneath the initiative for the integration of South American infrastructure, many of my colleagues over the past decade or so have disparaged the URSA, that it really doesn't exist, when in fact it really, really does exist. The problem is how to actually identify the massive nature and the integrated nature of this infrastructure is really quite complicated, and I'm going to explain to you why it's complicated. Their interest really is to create a multimodal transportation node of roads, waterways, and railways to really be able to bring agricultural productivity to industrial food processing plants in the Amazon, and then on to international markets, to really emphasize and build their mineral capacity to really focus on industrialization. Brazil's not interested in staying an agricultural country. They want to industrialize. That's how you develop. And this is all part of the plan to really increase competitiveness, to increase access to markets. As a geographer, I look at the Amazon and I'm like, wow, if you have all these waterways, it really is really close to markets. The economic, geographic benefit is really quite clear. And these projects are really big, and the massive size, well over the whole, URSA plan for South American continent, well over close to 600 plus projects now and counting. I don't want to talk about all of the plans, but I want to focus on what's happening in the Amazon. So we look at the Amazon, there are plans, most of them are national plans, even though they're under URSA, but they're being done by nations. There's going to be something like 21,000 kilometer of waterways that they want to make navigable, over 2 million kilometers of a highway network, a 15,000 kilometer networked railroad, cross-continental railroad, hundreds of ports, river ports that connect to oceanic ports so they can take barge ships up the rivers to the ports and then on to ocean carriers to bring the products to foreign markets. Then you have the national dam projects, and this is something many of my colleagues have been really focused on, dams. And they usually focus one dam at a time. And the problem they don't see is that the dam is just one part of the bigger strategy. The dam provides the ways to create a waterway. So many of these dams aren't necessarily for hydroelectric power, but they're to basically make the rivers navigable. And so all the national plans, we look at all of them combined for the Amazon, there's well over 800 dams that are in present, under construction, or planned for the Amazon basin. And this is an estimate trying to gather all the different plans from all the different nation states. But then also within the URSA plan, you have state level projects that connect those roads and railroads, and you even have down to local level projects that all of a sudden come together and make these integrated infrastructure systems making sense. And so that's what I want to focus on, really to give you an on-the-ground example. Many people think, oh, this is just a plan. Well, these are plans that have lots of investments and that are moving forward quickly. And so it's more than just a planning document, it's more than just Brazil seeing like the state and coming up with these plans. It's a great deal of foreign direct investment from private capital, from foreign governments, and they're moving quick. So I want to focus on the Tapajós River Valley, see if I can even. And so the Tapajós basically is one of the last tributaries of the Amazon that hasn't been dammed as of yet. And yet it cuts right through the heart of the Amazon. And their goal is to make the Mississippi of Brazil. And so I want to tell a story about the Tapajós River Valley. Basically, there are two plots to the story, and they're coming in into a collision. You have infrastructure development planned, and then you have indigenous self-determination. And so, not to let you see everything, but had the opportunity to take my son there before it's gone. These rocks and drops won't be here when these projects go through, and they're going through. also the territory of the Munduruku and Tupi-based indigenous populations that were pushed and forced from the coast into the basin. Pre-contact, there's something like 40,000 estimated populations of the last count. Now there's about 13,000 that live in the Munduruku areas. Their land is right in the heart of the Tapajos Valley projects. This is the Munduruku lands. Like I said, they're going to cut through the Amazon and create the Mississippi of Brazil. Have any of you been on the Mississippi? Down through New Orleans? I mean, is it really, it's not like, Huckleberry Finn and what you like to see. I mean, it's not a very pretty experience. My stepson did a canoeing trip all the way down, the whole entire way. So now I'm trying to get him excited to go, well, you should compare that now to the Tapajos. And so it's really, when you think about what will happen to this region if they make it the Mississippi of Brazil. But this really has been a plan a long time in the making. I won't go really there either, but the Hudson Institute had a plan back in the 1950s and 60s to actually dam up all of these rivers and create the Great Lakes of South America. So this is an idea that's been in the making, like I said, for a long time. But now they've come and put it together with a great deal of investments. So trying to, actually, there's so many projects. We have a paper we're hoping gets published soon that kind of goes through the whole detail of this specific project. If I can show you some of the things. So overall, looking at this, there's 5 dams that are planned. So these 5 dams, 3 of the dams, the main purpose of the 3 of the dams really is to get rid of those rapids. So the Chocorao is at that site where we had that picture with my son jumping on the rocks. That won't be there. That will be a waterway so that they can create a 900-kilometer waterway that will access, in combination with 11 ports, a port system with upgrades and building new ports, including a large transshipment facility here for grains. And so the idea is that the grains will come there from the Central West, where all the soy production is. When I first saw these projects, it's really hard to piece this together, so you have to really bring all of the projects from all the different levels together to see the big picture. The port seemed to be like it was out in the middle of nowhere. There was no roads, there was nothing connecting this port. I mean, how can you invest in this major transshipment port that doesn't go anywhere? And then we did a little more further digging, and we realized that there is a municipal level road that actually is connecting in Apiacas and Mato Grosso state, that actually connects the port to the Mato Grosso, I think it's the 206 highways, which then will connect it to major shipping corridors. So the idea is to bring the shipments of grain up to Itaituba, Imiratuba, where they're going to put in other transshipment ports, and they're going to create an industrial complex for food processing. So they want to process that food into food products, because countries don't develop by exporting just raw goods. And this is going to create many, many jobs. And then they're going to take it from there up to Santarém, and from Santarém they have another, up on barges, so they're going to expand the waterway so barges can go. And then they put it onto ocean-going ships and then ship it off to markets abroad. So it's a major investment that's very well thought through and has a lot of financial support. Another factor that's important to note is the mineral wealth. This is in yellow, all the gold reserves. I believe the best, or the largest gold reserve now that hasn't been tapped is in fact under Munduruku territory. Currently there are wildcat miners that have started negotiating and working with some of the Munduruku. So these are small companies, small individual groups, and they don't pay well, or they'll give them alcohol or give them something. It's created divisions within the Munduruku because they don't want to have these projects go through, and they don't want mining on their territory, and so there has been some division in that regard. But we just discovered that in January 2018, that Vale, which is a major Brazilian multinational mining corporation, has exploration rights to explore all of the mineral wealth underneath the Munduruku territories. And there's a whole list of other companies that have been given mineral rights. So There's also other resources, other minerals that are really important for steel and metallurgy that are found like bauxite and such in this area. And so what they've also invested in, or they're planning to invest in, is this pipeline in Santarém that will basically ship the mineral wealth from Altamira from Santarém to Altamira in the southeastern portion of the state, and on to Marabá, where they already have a metallurgy industrial plant, complex, very major complex tied to the Tucumã Dam. So when you look at the whole entirety of what's coming, it's really quite, I find startling. And it really is a sign that, the fires that are happening now, there's worse to come. And my concern about focusing just on the fires and not looking at the big picture of what's happening is they don't see this threat. But the Munduruku do see the threat. And in fact, my other subplot has to do with indigenous self-determination. And the Munduruku peoples are known to be a very fierce warrior people. And Ipireaya is we call it a social movement, but in fact it's part of their culture. Whenever there's a threat to the communities, they come together and they organize to fight it. And basically, Ipireaya in Munduruku translates to, we are strong, we know how to protect ourselves, and all that we believe in. And it was really telling to me, I thought, when in 2012 they joined forces with the Kayapo and the other social movements, anti-dam movements, to try to stop the Belamonte. So they were out there protesting, trying to stop it. When the Kayapo decided to negotiate with the government and they decided to do adaptive management, the Munduruku refused. They said, we are not negotiating. And they were really angered at the social movements and at the NGOs that basically were pushing them to do adaptive management. And then after the Belamonte was done and it's happening and all the things have gone wrong, the social movements move on to the next dam. And so the Munduruku decided that they're not going to participate in this larger movement. They're not going to depend on outsiders or anyone else to help them do what they need to do. Because they know, they're strong, they know what they, believe in, and they're going to protect themselves. And so they have basically put on a war footing, you would say, with the Brazilian government. They kicked out all researchers. They refused to allow the government to send in researchers to do the indigenous inventory. This part of the Constitution requires if there's going to be any projects, they have to get approval, which gets really confusing or complicated, approval from the indigenous peoples. But they call it a consultation. Well, what is consultation? You need to consult. So there's some debate whether the indigenous have any right to say no. But they realize that if they even begin this process, that it's a done deal. They've seen it happening. And so they they decided to use a strategy of non-negotiation. They refused to negotiate. And there's been situations that have gotten really violent and a great deal of tension. In 2012, and we don't want to go all into these details either, but in 2012, the military was sent in by the governor to try to force them to, let the government officials in to do their inventory, and they sent in helicopters, and supposedly they were going after some wildcat miners at the time, and yet the leader of the Kayapo was shot and killed. And so it really has created a great deal of tension. When you look into what's happening with the Munduruku, they seem to be taking violent action. They're doing what they need to do to protect themselves, and they have very explicit documents and declarations that they have put out. The Munduruku were known as the head cutters. They were considered very warrior-like. They would wear the heads of their enemies around their necks, and basically in one of their more recent declarations, they said they're going to do the same thing, and they're going to fight until the end. They have had some success. In fact, by not doing the participating in the indigenous study, they are actually able to stop, or at least I think temporarily pause, the São Luís de Tapajós dam. It hasn't been, I think it's temporarily, even though it's annulled or it's tabled, because it doesn't have its indigenous study, and you need to have the indigenous study in order to move forward. So is this a victory for agricultural and biodiversity conservation? I think it is, given all the threats and the pressure that they have to deal with. Although there's qualifications here, I think it's really like a David and Goliath situation. So can the Munduruku really fight the Brazilian government? Can they fight the Iranian, the Chinese investments? Can they fight against Alcoa, who's making investments, the Valley, those things, all these other foreign direct investments for all of these different projects? I mean, I can go through, it's Dupree, a Canadian company, you have these Swiss companies, and so there's a great deal of investments in this area, and I'm not sure they'll be able to fight it for long. But why do I think it's important as a step, or important that we should be concerned about this? Really, when you look at the policy retreat that is happening now, and this has been happening before Bolsonaro under Dilma and after, so that you keep having these the reduction in protected areas to make way for these different projects, and as the suspension for national security purposes, and so my colleagues have already kind of talked about all these policies that have been changed and occurred, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I also think it's important for this strategy because and this is something we can discuss, I think there's a lot of big weaknesses with the old and the new alternative strategies that environmentalists and social rights activists are trying to promote. Whether you're talking about community forest management or extractive economy, they haven't worked. And there's issues with agricultural intensification. So I've heard my colleagues on NPR and other places talking about, the solution to fires, they just need to do forestry. They need to do agroecology. They need to intensify agriculture. That's going to solve the problem. Well, with the projects that they have underway and the opportunity costs of some of these different extractive activities, it's unlikely it's going to happen in time. And it hasn't worked to date. And then the idea of biodiversity as the solution, that we can have an economy based on biodiversity. Well, given the projects that are moving forward and the investments that are made, all the gold, the mineral wealth, is there going to be anything left for the bioeconomy at that time? It's huge investments to really create a new third way on innovative biotech industry. And then payment for ecosystem services as well hasn't worked. And we can debate that as well. Not that these aren't solutions that we need to move forward, but they're not going to do it alone. And so it goes back to, is resistance actually a conservation solution? And should you care? Should you be part of the resistance? Well, I'd say that every social environmental change that has happened, whether we're talking about the Clean Air and Clean Water Act in the United States, or we're talking about the Rio Summit and all the great changes that happened in the 1990s, the 1988 Constitution and forward in Brazil, they came about because civil society resisted, put pressure on world leaders to make those changes. Because world leaders don't make changes just out of goodness of their heart. They need to have a constituency that's aware of the problem and is willing to be active. So, and as I said, if we don't, the fires are worse in what's to come. And so, I think that's it. Okay.
Okay, give me a second here. I'm Chris, by the way. I have a project called BioIntegrity. I'm really happy to be here because I went to UT in 1989 and haven't really been back since. But I'm an Austinite originally. And I moved back home not too long ago. Life is pretty good here. This is, an incredible community. It's the friendliest city in the United States, I think. And I've lived around. So, okay, here I go. So BioIntegrity, my project, is about this idea that effectively the biosphere is like your body. That your body has vital organs. Ecosystems on our planet have vital organs. And so I'm going to zoom all the way out to what I would call probably the biggest of big pictures in regards to the Amazon. And to get there, I want to start by reading this, which I know is a little bit pedantic maybe, but reading this paragraph from a book from 1997 by a woman named Gretchen Daly, who runs a project at Stanford called Natural Capital. Need some water. And this is one way to describe the big idea. So how to make a cake, or a great cake. If asked to identify all that goes into making a fine cake, a baker willing to share his or her secrets would most likely first identify its ingredients and the knowledge and skill required to transform them into a culinary work of art. He or she might also then describe the type of oven, pan, and various appliances and gadgets needed. If pressed further, an astute baker might also point out the need for capital infrastructure and human services to make that cake, to process, store, and transport the ingredients. With a helpful hint, he or she may even mention the cropland, the water, the chemicals, and the energy inputs into the whole process of creating a cake. However, the chances of the baker actually touching directly upon the natural renewal of the larger ecosystem, the soil fertility, the pollination of crops, natural pest control, the role of biodiversity in maintaining crop productivity, the services of cleanup and recycling biological materials, or indeed any of the other ecosystem services that are involved every day in everything we do all the time. That's extremely remote. Someone would say that right now. We're sort of completely out of touch with our reality, in a sense, that we depend on the larger biosphere to provide for us in every sense. Ecosystem services are absolutely essential to civilization. But as we all know, we live in an era of fascination with technology and industrialization. That's great, but it's obscuring what comes before that. This is a snapshot of productivity, effectively, on planet Earth. So as you can see, the Amazon is the largest ecosystem in terms of these environmental values shown here. And this is an animation of how the biosphere actually works. So this is how we live. This is why we live. This is what predates us, made our existence possible a few 100,000 years ago. And what you'll notice is ice comes down from the polar caps. That's seasonal change, right? The Amazon is green year-round because it's in the tropics. So are the other tropical forest systems in Central Africa and the Congo and in Southeast Asia, in the islands, and also in the other areas of Oceania. These forest systems are doing the majority of, or the most concentrated biological productivity work on our whole planet, creating the ecosystem services that affect us at global scale. So there's this analogy we've all heard that the Amazon, I should explain. This is 20 years of data compressed into one loop. So you'll just see it repeat over and over again. The Amazon is responsible for a significant portion of global freshwater filtration, global oxygen production, and other things that affect the climate. I'm going to show you some of those things. This mapping, or set of mappings, these are the fires 2 weeks ago at global scale. So I'll come to it in a second. But you can see tropical forests are by far the most biodiverse ecosystems on our planet, if you look on the left. The forest system is sort of effectively the same reason we live indoors. We spend most of our time indoors. It's shelter, it's relatively consistent climate and resources and water, and so on and so forth. So it's easier for species to stay there. It's easier for species to diversify there. And the Amazon is the most biodiverse ecosystem on the entire planet in mass. Again, here's another snapshot. This is from a site called globalmapping.org that everybody should check out. This is from the Atlas of Global Biodiversity, just another snapshot of how various ecosystems are productive on land. And then again, the fires, which we'll come back to in a minute. But you can see 2 weeks ago, this story broke about 3 weeks ago, primarily because of the fires outside of the Amazon and the smoke that went over Sao Paulo and created this uproar. Thank God it created an uproar, because these fires have been going for decades. Not hundreds of years per se at this scale, but essentially in our lifetimes we're talking about. So this sort of how the West was won, the development that made the United States into the most powerful economy in the world began with deforestation, and now it's happening to these last frontier forests and grasslands. The Amazon and tropical forests in general are requirements for the global biosphere to sustain itself and to stay alive and productive, also for the climate system to stay temperate. So this is more of the same. Moisture circulation is probably the most important under researched value. But what we know is that these forest systems act like capillaries in your body. So they take in moisture and they move it to a new place. They cycle it and they move it to a new place. At global scale, moisture is moving from east to west 365 days a year, essentially over the tropical forest system. So you can see this yellowy, green, red moisture concentration. And that's a snapshot from one moment in time, but it's like that day after day after day, year round. Same thing with heat absorption. You know, we have global warming. And the only way to really stabilize the temperature of the planet is to stop this deforestation and reestablish these forests that we've lost. The total system of tropical forests on the planet today is half or less of what it was in scale or size just 50 years or so ago. And the carbon, we were talking about the carbon in the first presentation. This is the largest carbon dense ecosystem. The tropical forests contain the most stored carbon of any of the land-based ecosystems. And when you include all the tropical forests, from the peat swamps to the rainforests and the various variations, as an overview of that type of forest in that part of the world, it's the most carbon dense ecosystem. It's the most concentrated carbon sink, biologically speaking, we have on the whole planet. So when we burn the forests, as you guys probably really well know, we release immense emissions per acre. Like a fair estimate would be 200 tons carbon dioxide released for every acre burned. Your lifetime carbon footprint then is about 9 acres worth of tropical forest, about 1,800 tons, if you live to be 90 years old and drive a large SUV and party all the time. Then carbon absorption, the other thing we're really trying to do, or I guess the thing we're talking about mostly when we talk about climate solutions, is eliminating greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Well, it turns out the best resource is that biological productivity of the tropical forests for pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. That daily photosynthesis, that daily production of vegetative biomass, that daily productivity of life, all those organisms interacting makes this part of the planet the best facility we have for taking greenhouse gas emissions, whether they're anthropogenic, made in the United States, or come from burning nearby forests and grasslands, take it out of the air and put it back into the biological economy to create new biological resources for our continued well-being. And the tropical forests, I won't go through all this stuff, but really as a fundamental of life, they have, in my estimation, two distinct categories. There are most concentrated life support systems, and they have these systemic climate values, which are shown here. I won't go through all of them, but we're talking about half or more of all the biodiversity on our planet in these forest systems, which cover today somewhere in the range of 5% of the planet. But it's super concentrated. Again, like your vital organs. It's the most productive system on the planet. They're pulling in somewhere in the range of 18% of global greenhouse gases per year. Some of those estimates are a lot higher. Some are a lot lower, depending on who you look at. And I also should mention that this moisture transference, which let me grab, can you have that back? I'm going to send some slides around too. So this global moisture balancing effect that the tropical forests have really do immediately determine weather and so forth. So I'm going to send these around. This is sort of more of what I'm talking about here. And you guys can just take a look at various climate and life support system values related to tropical forests. But was mentioned that tropical deforestation, particularly Amazon deforestation, affects drought in the United States, or even can create drought in the United States. So this is a study from 2015 that was really a breakthrough in identifying direct teleconnections between the Amazon's forest sustainability and the ability of that forest to pump moisture around the entire atmospheric system and keep California and the Southwest from going into drought. So there is in the literature, there's sort of been a moving of the goal line. We've been saying somewhat consistently throughout the literature that about 20% of the Amazon has been deforested already since 1970. That's now been moved back to maybe 18%. But what the reason it's been moved back, I think, is really to give us hope, because this is from a recent letter in Science magazine saying that if we get to 20% deforestation, then the Amazon will no longer be able to function, and no longer be able to keep itself alive and keep moisture circulation going. So the name of the game was really about intactedness. I was not nervous for like 30 minutes over there, and I can hardly speak. Anyway, the intactedness of the forests determines their ability to function. Again, just like your vital organs in your body. So if you start to segment any vital organ, it shuts down at some point. Effectively, what we're talking about from a biospheric perspective is that for the last 220 years or so, we've had a globalization arise and an industrialization come through that has been an economy at global scale of consumption without replenishment of the biospheric resources of our planet. That's what's happened to the Amazon. Theoretically, we could develop the crap out of the Amazon if we put back as much as we took away. Now we're in a position where, globally speaking, we need to bring back more than we're currently destroying. We need to protect what's left and then restore at an even greater scale. There's a report that was leaked last month by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the big UN body that kind of characterizes the climate conversation around the world. And they finally got to the point of the global biosphere and to the climate system. And this is actually a synopsis out of Vice magazine, which I realize is not an accredited academic resource, but they do a great job of summarizing stuff sometimes in their articles. So you can see here, this, we're talking about a new aspect of how to win or how to avoid the worst damage on the climate crisis is not just about stopping emissions. We have to actually protect biological functionality of the planet and strengthen that at this point. We're already at the point of the red line. So the bad news on the Amazon fires is it's been going on for 40, 50 years, relative scale to where we are now. About 20% of the Amazon is gone. We're at the tipping point now. We have to act as fast as we can. And my project, BioIntegrity, is about trying to change culture on this, because as these guys showed so well, there are so many facets, so many policies, so many economic interests, so many people's lives involved in this whole issue, that unless we really change what we care about, I think particularly at the apex of wealth in the world, we don't really have much of a chance to do what they're telling us to do here, which is stop the deforestation and stop the dehydration of the planet's most powerful ecosystems. And the number one thing that's driving all this, if it's not clear already, is food production in these forests. Just out and out clearing lands to get what they call sweetgrass for ranching, or to put in soy to feed the cattle or some other agricultural product. But we're talking about, as you see, the IPCC report is saying we're there. We're at the point of act now or threaten the planet's ability to keep us alive. And this is this amazing woman who runs the communications for the Indigenous Rights Project at the UN. And her summary on this upcoming climate report from the IPCC is that we have to transform the way we're acting to survive. So I'm skipping over this one, but you can read, you guys can scan that really quickly. We've taken down an enormous amount of forests in just 50 years, roughly 60 to 65% the size of the continental United States. And so again, this is fires versus productivity. We're attacking the most important ecosystems on the planet from a biospheric perspective, which is also a climate perspective. The two integrate, of course. It should be pointed out that 2 weeks ago, when we were really in the international media and there was an uproar, the Amazon fires were terrible. The fires outside of the Amazon were terrible. They were worse in Bolivia and they were 5 times worse in the Congo and the grasslands of Africa. So big picture, simple wise, what we're talking about here, again, is food production, just clearing lands for agriculture and ranching, primarily ranching. In infrastructure projects, roads and dams, primarily. People are taking down forests to put these things in. It's to some degree, for some folks it's easy money, for other folks it's survival. And the overall just expansion of humanity, you know. I was born in 71, you were talking about you were born in 89 or something? 88, okay. So, you know, when I was born, nearly 50 years ago, there were less than 4 billion people on Earth. So now we're at 2020, virtually. About 50 years later, there's nearly 8 billion people on Earth. The first time there were a billion people on Earth was in 1804, when Thomas Jefferson was getting reelected president. We are scale jumping in population, we're scale jumping in consumption without replenishment. And so the general expansion of humanity is not taking into account the reality of its biospheric host that it depends on. Everything is in trouble from this perspective right now. So I sort of suggest that there's been some, you know, major things that have happened over the course of our existence on this planet, but now we need to really get serious about creating economies of environmental stewardship that protect the biospheric assets, that make everything else possible, and strengthen those. And that cake analogy, this is a cake that I made. This was my version of Gretchen Daly's paragraph. To get to the point of having the cake, you know, to get to the point of making money, having air conditioning, plate glass windows, and amazing iPhones, and all the things that we rely on and consider to be reality, there's all these other pieces that pre-exist, have to function well before that. Starting with just the assets themselves, which is what we're destroying right now by these fires around the world, and particularly Amazon. The assets and the functionality are gone, of course, when they're destroyed. But those assets create services, those services create benefits, and so on. And eventually you have enough biological wealth and stability that you can build a materialist economy and run it like crazy for about 220 years before you hit the wall that we're hitting now. So this is one way to title this would be, this is the pre-profit economy. All of these things have to be functioning at massively robust health for us to have everything else that we all dream of, that we all want. What can you do? What are some things that you can do that really matter? Here's a quick short list. There are more things than what's on this list, but the most important thing is to protect the remaining old growth systems. So the Amazon is the largest of the old growth tropical forest systems, and I'll show you a project that my group's promoting in just a second. Empowering indigenous peoples, if you're not aware, this is a primary value also, which is part of the reason we're talking about indigenous people so much here. It's a primary value because all of the research shows that indigenous communities who have lived on these lands, lived in these ecosystems, have cosmologies that are defined by these places that date back hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of years. Those people are better caretakers, they're better stewards of those ecosystems than those of us that come from Stanford and UT and other enlightened places in the world. Their reality is about their relational existence with everything there. We haven't really gotten there yet. Our reality is still more screen-oriented, especially lately more screen-oriented. And so we're trying to apply sort of intellect to a relational reality. The indigenous people have a lot to teach us, but we have to protect them and empower them with land rights, community-based development, and leadership as we begin to move into a new era of protecting and restoring the biosphere. Ranchers slowing deforestation, I've got a group for you that you can support if you're interested in that. That's a key thing right now because, as you've seen, the Brazilian politics are totally entrenched at the moment. You think the United States is at a gridlock. Well, it doesn't look like it's going to be easy, probably everyone would agree, to make major shifts in restoring indigenous rights, restoring assets to fight fires, in preventing future fire, and taking care of fines for malfeasance in the Amazon and other places. Anytime soon, it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon because the politics are so oriented towards Brazilian safety and this manifest destiny that has now sort of taken over the federal system in Brazil. But there are some organizations that are trying to, well, let me stay on this for one sec. So there's educating the ranchers on how to better make use of fire, giving them essentially technology to monitor their lands so that they can say, well, I don't need to just burn willy-nilly, I'll burn in this one area. This particular pocket of forest is more important to me, as well as empowering these ranchers to fight fires is an extremely important solution right now. It's really one of the only assets we have in the Amazon itself. There are good national policies around the world, not particularly in Brazil right now. There's also some good global calls from the academic community to really change the standard that we apply to how we live on Earth. You can support those things as easily as signing petitions. You may have heard of this thing, Follow the Frog. There's, not Rainforest Action Network, Rainforest Alliance, thank you. Puts a frog logo on products that are certified as not being destructive to rainforests. So that's on coffee and all kinds of other things. Look up Follow the Frog on YouTube, and there's great stuff on that. Again, I think we have to get real about this being a wake-up call to change our conception of wealth and our conception of success at the highest levels. Because we are at the tipping point now, effectively, for the Amazon, because as they said, there is no reason to believe that Bolsonaro is going to have a change of heart. And he's only been in office now for 9 months. He's got a ways to go. The party that took over the Brazilian federal system a few years ago already did a lot of damage to position Brazil so that it wouldn't have the ability to fight these fires. So we're looking at, I think, a much larger mission here to enlighten ourselves, to enlighten the people around us, to change the standards that we live by as global citizens, and to call for wealthy people to really step up. The folks that have the resources can help these quilombos. They can make community-based development investments. They can help the firefighters. They can help some of the safety issues. And there's a lot of wealth in the world that's just being hoarded at the moment, and we need that investment in ourselves to move forward. And you know, everybody here knows they should talk and share and self-educate on these issues. This is a critical time. A couple of examples of how you can help protect old growth forests and empower indigenous peoples. This is the petitions I mentioned. These are just great things you can go to and sign. Primaryforest.org has this Intact petition, and Global Deal for Nature has the Global Deal for Nature petition. These are calls to global leaders to get busy on protecting the ability of humanity to continue living on Earth. The project that my group is supporting, I won't go into detail about, but it's called Saving Indigenous Lands in the Amazon. It's based in Peru. It's 76 cents an acre to participate in a project of over 6 million acres of conservation that empowers 220 indigenous communities with legal title to their homelands. You can get that from biointegrity.net/solutions. And then I mentioned the ranchers. This group's getting a lot of press all of a sudden. They've been around for a few years. They're super effective, and you can kind of scan through here. But Aliança da Terra was started by an American who went to the Brazilian Amazon to become a rancher. And they realized he described it as hell. The burn seasons that happen every year is just insane. There's fire and heat everywhere. And, you know, they're just clearing lands as fast as they can, while they can. And Bolsonaro, effectively, his identity, his campaign, this President Bolsonaro, if that hasn't already been stated, is empowering reckless abandon with fires. There are no downsides from the standpoint of setting the fire. You're not going to get in trouble. This group is trying to provide farmers with the information they need to make better decisions about when they burn. They're now they've only been around 8 years, and they're really well integrated with over, 20,000 people participating. So we're talking about to save the Amazon, to save tropical forests, to move this experiment of civilization and so forth, to move it forward. We're talking about really substantive change at global scale that has to do with how we want to live in the future. There's no reason the future can't be brighter, even with the insanity of global warming and climate change that we're all seeing now. A protection and restoration approach to how we develop future civilization, where we revegetate and reconnect ecosystems and integrate vegetation, like this beautiful setting right here, into the built places we live, can create food resources, can stabilize and protect us against extreme weather, can absorb an enormous amount of carbon, can save species, on and on and on. So one little simple idea here is, this is effectively, on the top of the list of most important things you want to get involved in if you care about environmental issues or human sustainability. And so this shows basically what the Amazon was. I realize it's blurry, but here we are a few years ago. This is the amount of forest that's been reduced just in the last 5 decades or so. Another summary from that IPCC report that was leaked out last month from an African magazine. These are complicated topics. There's a lot to say about each little aspect of it, but when you destroy the forest systems, you destroy this moisture circulation function, and you cause heat spikes on land. So deforested lands will be 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than the forest right next door, where it hasn't been cleared. That tends to spin up hurricanes and other extreme weather, cause drought. That affects us everywhere, as you saw on that slide that showed the arrows going to California and the Southwest. These things are expensive and damaging and deadly. And we want great water quality, right? We all want great water, we all want great air. Like, there's no real complex idea here. We're just going in the wrong direction still at the moment, and we're at a very significant scale now of wrong directionedness. So I think that's pretty much what I have. This, again, is the real deal. That's how we exist. It's the biosphere. And please check out my project if you have a chance. I have so much more to say, but I'll cut it at that. Okay, thank you.
I want to thank the panelists for these excellent presentations. Do you have some time for some questions from the audience? Yes.
So, in terms of next steps, I see calls for action of really wildly different scales, from very small individual things to supporting local NGOs, and then the step of fundamentally changing our economic system. And I want to ask, is there a way to balance the need for change with the obvious desire of Brazil to want to develop the Amazon, and to essentially a middle ground between the two that'll be possibly more sustainable than either of the things proposed so far? And I'm just addressing this to everybody.
I think what I probably didn't say very clearly, but this idea that we have to put back more than we've destroyed now. We have to have a Banksy drawing, where it's somebody throwing a bouquet of flowers forward. This idea that we have to lob life into the future. We have to put more life on the planet than people have ever endeavored to do before, particularly through wildernesses. So we don't really get to decide to wait and see. We have to move as fast as we can to address all of these needs. But again, the fundamental is the functionality of the biosphere. So at the moment, we're just moving without considering that. There is no biospheric thinking going on. To some degree, it would be destructive for sure, but this image you were shown of the waterway that will be converted into a rolling stream at some level. Putting vegetation back as those developments are made is not an ideal solution, but we've already got cities that are giant heat sinks, and if we revegetate our cities, for instance, that's approaching a middle path to creating more of a harmonic wholeness between the necessity of having stability at the biospheric scale and the necessity of maintaining and growing the human economy.
Okay. I'm a pessimist. So I'm going to step back and try to think about this for a second. I think it's important to realize that these development projects didn't just start recently. This has been the development paradigm that was moved and was basically introduced by the U.S. and especially the U.S. in terms of early on with development. How should you develop? Well, you build the roads, you expand agriculture, you engage in the markets, you industrialize, you go to industrialization, you create jobs. Many of these projects, as I had said, were developed under the Brazilian military with in consultation with various groups in the U.S. And so right now they're pursuing the U.S.'s model directly. So if you look at the Tennessee Valley Authority, you look at how the U.S. was able to become, a real major economic player, was by creating roads, by building dams, by converting our forests into planted trees, into plantations. So there has been, this has been an ongoing process, and it's happened since the military government initiated it, and under every single government. So it didn't matter whether you were the Worker Party or you were, Cardoso, who initiated the first URSA plans. I mean, this has been consistent. And one thing that's been consistent are these development plans. What I find startling and challenging and disappointing is this, after the Rio Summit and this movement towards sustainable development and this move to all these community forest projects, it seemed as though everyone in the development community that was concerned about rural populations, concerned about the environment, assumed that, the development paradigm changed. It's no longer this modernist paradigm. But if you actually, and we're doing this calculation right now, just looking at Brazil, and if you take the amount of money that they invest in development, and you compare that to how much money is actually being invested in sustainable development type of projects, looking at the Amazon Fund, 98% of all the monies that go towards any type of development go towards these very large infrastructure projects, and less than 2% go towards sustainable development, and that money's was coming from the Amazon Development Fund, which meant it was coming from international companies. And so this has been an ongoing process. I'm not as optimistic about the ranchers, because I've worked with many of the ranchers. There's a lot of leakage on these that are supposed to be green livestock. So they're not deforesting on their property, but in fact they're actually buying calves and they're renting land on the smallholders' properties in the asentamientos or the settlements. And so there's deforestation happening there, so there's always leakage. And the problem with some of these projects, they don't see what's happening on the ground. And the geographic interconnection is much more complex. And I know many, in the area I work in the south of Pará, which is one of the major beef production areas really in the world, with major slaughterhouses exporting beef internationally. And this is one of the key areas where they're focusing on green livestock. And there is a process whereby the ranchers have to get certification that the cows or the calves they're selling to the slaughterhouse actually had the origin on their property, but they're falsified. And on the ground, it's happening. And so there are these other challenges. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be moving forward in that way, but that's not going to be a solution onto itself. The same thing with ecosystem services, that many people argue, well, we should just, ecosystem services are the solution. If we can value the ecosystem services, what they can provide, then it would be good, and we can pay people to maintain the forest. Well, the problem is when you think about economics, there has to be a consumer who's willing to pay, and they haven't been willing to pay. There's no one paying for those ecosystem services in the Amazon. There's no one paying for those ecosystem services. The governments have already, the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Accords, deciding to cancel its requirement of reducing greenhouse emissions. That basically, and Brazil as well doing it, there's no longer a need to buy those carbon credits because no one's paying attention. They're not that we give up, but it's not a solution. I've got colleagues who that's what they focus on. And so I'm less optimistic about Brazil changing its direction. I think this has been an ongoing movement. I think there is a hegemonic development paradigm, and that has never ended. I think sustainable development was kind of like a detour that was a distraction, so that everyone else kind of calmed down and thought, okay, we have sustainable development, when in fact, if you look in the Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon, all those early projects for extractive reserves and community forest management practices, projects, they don't exist anymore. They've been deforested. They keep moving further and further into the forest. But once those roads get there, and now there is access to markets, and there's other opportunities for using the land, even local traditional peoples change their culture. Whether we're talking about the Brazil nut tappers in the Chico Mendes Reserve. Many of them don't tap rubber anymore, they've got cattle, because there's no market to sell the rubber. I mean, everything's very complicated, and so on one hand, I think sometimes getting overwhelmed with all the things you should do or could do, changing our lives here. I mean, cultural change, technological change takes a long time. You know, here in the U.S., to convince everybody to change their lifestyles is going to take a long time. But I think having your eyes open to what's really happening and then addressing it. There's one thing that is almost like sacrilegious to say in front of colleagues. There was a real debate about paper parks. You know, we just can't keep these parks and these lands with gates around it and armed guards. People have to live in those parks. You know, but there's been many studies and evidence has shown that yes, in the beginning, people live there, they use the resources more sustainably, they do sell their extractive goods, but once the road comes in, once they have access to do other activities, they frequently change. I would venture to say vast majority have, from my experience in the Amazon, because they have needs to improve their well-being and livelihood. And I know like many of the people who are living in these extractive reserves migrated from the northeast of Brazil. They weren't rubber tappers all their life. They went there and they're rubber tapping because it's something to do. When they can change that and shift to cattle, they have. And so we're seeing that across the tropics. And the problem with ecosystem services is that it's substitutable as well. So yes, if you could put a value on the forest, and so the only value it has is what it can provide for us, well, once you have a new technology and we don't need those forests anymore, then it has no value. So I think there is a point with which we need to think and take maybe a moral position. And so maybe it would be better instead of having, it's interesting. So you have on the right political groups are saying, oh, they just want us to stop development, put everything into parks and put fences around it. But then also they don't realize on the left, they don't want to hear that either, because you need to have people living in those areas. We can't have paper parks. I think it may be we need to rethink, well, maybe we do need to have protected areas, and maybe we do need to put fences around them, and maybe we do need to have areas that we have a no-go zone. Because once people are there, over time, progressively, it erodes out that forest. And so, it's politically incorrect to say, maybe we need to go back to some parks, if you can protect it. In a study region where I worked with Eugenio looking at the Brazil nut polygon, which in fact was one of the leading extractive economies in the world for Brazil nuts. It was up until 1973, it had 97% of its forest, and by 1973 to something 2000, it's got nothing. Well, what happened to the forest if the extractive resources were so valuable? It's a very complicated story. But I was trying to, I was giving a presentation, trying to give an image of what it looked like before it was completely deforested, and I couldn't find any older images. But there's a forest reserve by Vale de Doce, which is the multinational mineral company I was talking about that is doing mining in that region. They were required to create a forest preserve. And the only place I could find intact forest was on their forest preserve. And their forest preserve does have a fence around it, and it does have machine guns and such. I mean, this is extreme, but it may be that, maybe we shouldn't be on the land and trying to use it and maintain it. And maybe people do want to move to the city and have, I know, I work in the field and I talk with a lot of the smallholders, and not all of them want that for the rest of their life. So, maybe we need to rethink the paradigm of how to move forward. That's always politically incorrect.
Well, there are a lot of young folks here, so try to give a more optimistic view. So your question is the $1 million question, right? So how do we achieve sustainable development? And I don't have the answer. But I will say that there are a few things that are interesting in the Brazilian context. For example, there was a poll that was conducted 2 weeks ago that showed that if you live in cities, which is the vast majority of the Brazilian population, they all are for the preservation of the Amazon. It's like 80%, it's an absurd number. So if you look at where most of Brazilians live. They are heavily support conservation efforts. We talk a lot about the agribusiness sector here, but we have to separate the chaff from the wheat. There is a portion of the agribusiness that is very serious about complying with environmental regulations. And those are mostly ones that are connected to international markets. So they were the ones who actually forced Bolsonaro to fight the fires in the Amazon. He sent the army there to fight the fires. Why? Because they knew that several countries were thinking about boycotting Brazilian products from the Amazon. There was a news last week that H&M, one of these big companies, they buy leather from Brazil and they were suspending their purchases. They knew that, well, if this snowballs to include soybean products and beef products, that would be really bad for business. So they were the ones who actually said, well, what you're doing, Bolsonaro, is super bad for business. Please stop. Of course, the ones putting fire there, a lot of them are not interested in international markets. They just want to grab land, set their property boundaries, set their rights to land, and then sell it and move on. So in that case, you really need a different strategy, and maybe increase enforcement. That's the reality. So there are market mechanisms that are work in certain circumstances for a certain public, but it's not. There is no panacea that will solve all the problems.
Let's take another. I think there was another question. Yes. Yes, please.
Yeah. So I wanted to just mention two things. First, I was very surprised. I come from Bolivia, and I was very surprised to see how the Amazon and the fires are not, or are kind of respecting the
Protected areas.
yeah, the fictional boundaries between the countries. That's one first impression that I had. But on the other hand, I wanted to go back to Professor Cynthia's presentation, because I agree with her vision, particularly of the issue and in her analysis. But also, I wanted to ask you more. What do you think about the expansion specifically, or the role of China in these issues? Understanding that China is permanently expanding its demands to our countries, and specifically in terms of soy. And of course, we're not talking about organic soy, so it comes with a technological change and use of the land too. So I would like to know more about that.
Yeah, I think that actually makes prospects worse about protecting the Amazon. The real resurgence in dam building and these large-scale projects in 2000 came about as a result of the BRIC nations getting power. So Brazil, having the economic resources where it can invest in its own projects and projects across South America, and they didn't need to worry about getting money from the World Bank, so they weren't beholden to the World Bank. There was a hopeful, we thought, pause maybe in some of the fast pace of development when Brazil started going through an economic crisis, which is a bad thing to say, but if they didn't have the money to make an investments, that would be great. But then China came through, and China's investment bank has provided many resources, and Iran has come through, and Iran is providing the resources, and so there's new resource pools to support these infrastructure investments. And they don't have the same regulations, the same environmental impact assessments. Even so, the World Bank and many of the international community had already decided that each country needs to decide on its own environmental impact assessment to move away from the World Bank standards. Well, now you have countries that really aren't as concerned about the environmental impacts. And of course, I think environmental impact assessments are very problematic in and of themselves. So it's problematic. And when it comes to demand for food, the global demand for food and resources is in fact coming from countries like China. And the Amazon is a wonderful place to get all those resources they need. So it's a great market. Now they are going to have the same restrictions of the same, potentially as maybe the EU or some of the other countries. We need to have the sustainable, the organic soy, and put on restrictions that may have offset some of the prospects. So I think that these new source of pool of resources and motivations really is driving these projects to go forward.
Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for all your presentations. They were very illuminating about what's going on right now. But I wanted to, my question is more directed towards the political issue, because in the end, all of the solutions you gave us, like to solve the problem, are very enlightening, but I believe that probably as single individuals in the United States, for us, the concern we have, it's more difficult to try to tackle the issue this way. So I was thinking that taking into account, and Dr. Simmons also said it, that a lot of the impact on the burns and the burnings have to do, of the fires, sorry, have to do with the investment of the United States on the projects in the Amazon. I was wondering, what do you think about turning this conversation political, and what can we do from the United States towards the effects that the U.S. colonialism has had on the Amazon?
Can you ask your question to us? I want those together.
Okay, thank you all for your presentations. My question would be, what do you all see as the research gaps going forward in terms of, you seem to know a lot about what's going on the ground, the dynamics of certain regions, a larger mega infrastructure project for an entire watershed. Where are the human environment what are the frontiers of human environment research for the Brazilian Amazon given this context?
Well, I have a couple of soundbite things I want to try and throw into some issues. Put them at the top. One is, I think, back to the middle path question, we have to deal with the Amazon and its functionality no matter what. That's really what I was trying to show. That the economy's history of destroying things doesn't work. So the current sort of policy mechanisms and investment mechanisms are doing the wrong thing at the present. We've gone too far. And we have, the middle path is going to be about, I think, a massive awakening, where we again begin to realize this living system requires a certain amount of intactedness. And let me also say that restoration in the tropics can be super fast. It's like supercharged, because the moisture movement is so consistent at the equator. So you can have a completely deforested area go to closed canopy in 3 to 5 years, just from, not all the time, but just from, not in every place, but just from good sort of permaculture-based design to restore diversity and productivity. And in terms of investments and so forth, my approach to that right now, again, is that as she said, we're individuals here in the United States, we're pretty far away. How do you affect change? I think it's about awakening to the necessity of making change happen. And so my project is trying to facilitate that, to give people information so they can see. The Amazon is like the heart of the planet. It's the biggest pumping organ for moisture, and it has a lot of other functions as well. So our institutions don't have any reckoning that we rely on other living things, really, that they're just oriented towards a different model of reality entirely. To address the investment scenario at scale, we all need to be thinking differently about the importance of every other living thing on the planet, and the fact that, unfortunately for us, we have diminished, destroyed, fragmented, and disabled an overwhelming amount of the rest of the biosphere in the last 50 years. And now is the time to deal with that. Dealing with that is a huge climate solution. In terms of frontier science in the Amazon, I think, off the top of my head, one of the most important, interesting things I haven't seen vetted out yet is there was a giant tropical forest at the bottom of Brazil, also on the coastline, called the Atlantic Tropical Forest. That system was presumably responsible for pumping moisture to the southern Amazon, which is now really under attack. But we've had these 3 extreme droughts in the last 14 years, since 2005. And what's happening is the moisture flow that happens at atmospheric scale between forest systems and within forest systems. Literally, the Atlantic tropical forest was on the ocean, so ocean vapor would move through that forest system across grasslands 1,700 miles from Sao Paulo all the way to the Amazon. The Atlantic tropical forest has been about 94% just destroyed. Primarily, again, in the last 100 years, 50 years, it's happened super fast as population has expanded and everything else related to that. So, to what degree can we, there's a great project that's going well so far to reforest 1 million acres, but we're talking about a lot more than 1 million acres lost in my lifetime. If we put that back where it can be restored, how would that benefit reduction of drought in the Amazon? How would that position the Amazon to be more resilient? And let me add a couple more sound bites to that if I can squeeze them in. One is that the Amazon is older than effectively any other ecosystem. The tropical forest systems were here when the dinosaurs were here. They are more resilient than any other ecosystem on Earth. The continuation of life after the extinction crisis of the dinosaurs restarted primarily through tropical forests. So as an investment, investing in the Amazon to take care of itself, restoring it to where it can achieve that, doing the science to find out what that means. How do we get to the second frontier science thing, I think, is an integrated reality between this enormously human-centric world we have now, where it's going to be hard to stop this giant highway going through the Amazon. But how do we maintain the functionality of the Amazon even when there's asphalt going in and segmenting the ability of the ecosystem to sustain itself? Are there things that are biologically oriented that can address these issues so that we don't see the Amazon shut down and stop functioning potentially within the period of the first Bolsonaro administration in terms of how close we are on things? And if we were to see that happen, if the Amazon were to start to become a savanna before 2030, before 2025 in places, what kind of science will direct us to the best means to reverse that? We know we can reverse desertification. There's the Great Green Wall going across Africa. There's the restoration of forests in China to reverse deforestation there. The reforestation in China of the last 30 years or so is restored an area the size of Maryland. These massive areas of land that can be restored to a certain level of productivity, and then they start to become their own self-maintaining, net positive systems. So how can we integrate that into that reality and the historical strength of a system like the Amazon into how we move forward with development and so forth? Back to the middle path question, how can we take advantage of what makes life possible for us in a context where we are becoming more and more reliant on development?
With regards to the question about politics, have you read, and I know this is probably it's assigned by professors in many undergraduate classes in your introductory English classes, but The Plague by Camus, where essentially the thesis is to keep fighting even a losing battle. I come to that, I think, I've been reflecting on my freshman philosophy class all the time the last several weeks from my travels in Brazil. And throughout, everyone here who is at this panel cares deeply about this issue and wrestles with this every day. And I oscillate in a single day between optimism and deep, crushing pessimism. But the optimism comes from my interactions with people on the ground. And so what can you do? I think the solution has to be holistic. There are many solutions, possible solutions. I would pick one that most aligns with who you are and what you choose to dedicate your life to. In mine, I think I'm pursuing raising hell on the political side by ratcheting up pressure. And I was also pessimistic about what does it matter, international outcry to a regime, to an administration that I think is benefiting politically, locally, at least in the short term, from fighting with France about Macron's wife, right? But on the other hand, politics move in cycles. And the people who I interact with on the ground that are fighting the Alcantara space launch site insist that international pressure is fundamental to stopping the space, and this is something, the expansion of the space, and this is something that we can do, and we are working on at the Rappaport Center to provide a toolkit for people at the University of Texas and abroad. We're translating the campaign into multiple languages to pressure legislators to write op-eds. Is it a losing battle? Maybe, but what are we going to do? Are we just going to sit on our hands? And that really, I think, just has to be, I still think doing something is better than not doing anything, because I couldn't live with myself if we didn't do something.
So to the question about where do we look to place blame, when we look at the investments that are being made, they are, the U.S. corporations, which really now are no longer U.S. corporations. We got global food systems. We got a global economy that's not beholden to any one, country or nation. Moving back to Florida, I was really amazed to find out that the degradation that's happening to the Swanee River Valley is coming from Pilgrim's Pride and the chicken farms. Well, Pilgrim's Pride was bought by JBS, which is one of the leading meat producers in the world, and also happens to be Brazilian, that also happens to be with degrading the Amazon. So, Alcoa is an American corporation. We need to think, I think that there is resistance, and as I said, is something we can do. Every single change has happened because of civil society resistance from the beginning of time. Political leaders don't just change their minds. It's not just Bolsonaro, it's not just Trump. I mean, these projects have been ongoing, this mindset. So when we think about all the outcry and the organizing, the environmental justice movement here in the U.S. forced the government to put in place the Clean Water Act. Of course, within a matter of a year or so, we can get rid of it, one president can. But also the outcry to bring about these sustainable development projects. I think sustainable development as a paradigm. I think we need to think about participating in that way and being aware. I mean, yes, you can who you buy your things from, but you do have a voice when it comes to who do you elect and who do who you're going to stand behind. And this isn't fake news. In terms of what I think is an important research project for the Amazon, and this is something I actually, Eugenio and I have worked on a proposal we've tried to get funded for the past 10 years at NSF, and we've had a really hard time because no one wanted to believe that there really was this large-scale project coming their way. But we have, in fact, written a paper, Biotropica, that came out just this past year. If you want to go and read it, it's called Amazonian, I can't remember the name of the Amazonian Futures or Amazonian Conservation. And we kind of lay out, we can, with the technology and the science we have, we can actually model the impact of the cumulative and synergistic effects of all the different projects. And we can actually spatially identify where those impacts can be. And what we've proposed is if we can model this, it's not just land change that's going to happen and deforestation, it's going to attract populations. Populations are basically going to change the whole urban outlook and the landscape in the Amazon. It's going to look very much like the U.S. And my concern is that there's not going to be land that they want to reforest. If you have a city and you have a suburban area and you have pastures and you have soy and these different types of activities, we also predict that the population can explode, and you can actually have a transformation, a flipping of south of Brazil, where is the major industrial core, and shipping to have that instead be in the Amazon, which can completely transform. And it's not an unreal possibility. Again, some work on that. But so there are things that can be done. Science can identify and try to help. If we can identify what those impacts are going to be before they make the decision to go forward, maybe help to identify a sustainable solution. Well, maybe not this dam. Maybe the solution would be to allow Vale Hiadose to mine in the Munduruku lands. They'll be less destructive than the wildcat miners. They could probably pay a lot of money in royalties to the indigenous peoples who actually may want it and accept it. They've actually done a pretty good job protecting their areas. I think large-scale mining has less of an impact when it's done in a technologically advanced way than the wildcat mining. And I'm kind of surprised I'm saying this. It's really something I've come to over trying to look at the situation. And it's also become an issue that they're using those tactics now to get the indigenous peoples to go ahead with the projects. That's what they did with the Kayapo, to get them to be okay with the Belamonte, providing them with resources and splitting up the communities. My real issue with indigenous peoples, I don't prescribe to the fact that they're necessarily traditional or that have more of an innate connection with their environment per se, because they do change as well. We have a number of indigenous reserves where they have cattle and they have soy and they're as engaged. But they have the right to their land because the ILO Convention gave them the right based on Aboriginal habitation. They were there first. And according to the Brazilian Constitution, they have a right to the land because they were there first. And so how they use their resources, is a question. So if they're not sustainable, should they not have the land? And how they choose to, exist. And so with the Munduruku, they don't want these projects. They want to keep their land. They want to have their lifeways preserved, their areas preserved. And so supporting them for that reason, I think is very important. And it does happen that they do protect their environment, which is good for biodiversity and conservation. So there are different ways I think we need to think about this problem, and not point to, the U.S. did it back then, so therefore, how can you point a finger at us now? I completely agree. And the U.S. is still doing it. Is the thing that really kills me. Moving back to Florida, seeing how much degradation and wetlands have been completely obliterated, even though we had environmental laws saying they couldn't do it. It's the way our economies function. Now, can we change it? Yeah, over time maybe. But so I think there are ways to look at this, but I think it's going to take thinking outside the box, not getting so hung up on ideologies. I find out ideologies oftentimes are what motivate or guide. So I'm not pessimistic in that way. But
I know, but I want to counter pessimism just a little bit.
just briefly though. I think I was pessimistic.
Well, I don't mean to attack or anything, but part of what we're dealing with is this radical, weird era politically here, where fringe development interests, which are innately destructive to ecosystems, have taken over the major political systems in the most important parts of the world. If it had gone the other way, if Bernie had been elected in the United States, or if someone in Brazil had been elected that really cares about the Amazon, they've already shown us how to reduce deforestation and facilitate productive business. There was the famous soy moratorium that we didn't really get into this, but in 2012, deforestation was at an all-time low, and academically speaking, there wasn't much suffering going on to the communities economically. That they got rid of the bad actors. Now, there was a lot of leakage. A lot of that stuff went outside of the Brazilian Amazon, but that's part of the challenge here. And one other piece of information that's important is there's a study from 2018 that shows that we can keep up with the food demands of a growing population based on the fallow lands that are in Brazil right now that were deforested that have not been restored. So, good luck moving tens of thousands of ranchers to those lands, but from a biospheric perspective, again, I'm promoting this idea of biointegrity, that this value of the integrity or the wholeness of the living system has to come before our conversation about everything else. That's what's most determining for us. And there are enough fallow lands, according to a FAO study or something like that, in Brazil today to make business in the Amazon still profitable and to feed people and so on and so forth. So these transitions are accessible. If leadership were to change at national scale, we could be in a completely sunnier place. This is the world that we navigate, and I think we're all starting to wake up to try and figure out what we can do to contribute, and what we do to rebuild and restore from the damage that's being done right now.
So our time is up, but I wanted to thank the audience for coming and the panelists for these excellent presentations.